Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A friend of mine recently spoke to 150 people at Microsoft for Startups about entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurs really benefit society. And so I gotta tell you, I was fascinated by his topic and by his presentation and the fact that he would speak to 150 young entrepreneurs about entrepreneurship. And so I wanted to reach out to Murray Simser, who is a really interesting guy. He's got a political background, he's got a business background, he's got a technology background, and now he's launching a democracy app, Citizen, which we'll probably talk about. But you worked for, was it John Turner you worked for in Parliament Hill?
No, I actually worked in the official leader of the opposition's office for Jean Chrétien just before he became prime minister.
And then you went to Microsoft. You went to the Silicon Valley.
Well, that's a hop, skip, and a jump, but there was about 5 years between those while I was at university. But I did end up in Silicon Valley. And funny, Service Canada ran my CRM software, so all Canadians have used it at some point.
And then you've come back to Toronto, and you're now launching Citizen, which is a democracy app, which we'll talk about a little bit. But the speech that you made to 150 young entrepreneurs was about entrepreneurship. Why do you think speaking to young entrepreneurs about entrepreneurship is important?
Well, if we think about the great software that the West has invented and distributed across the world, there are really two things that are important. Okay, and both of them relate to, I love the balloons. Both of them relate to the concept of maximizing people's contribution to society. That's capitalism and democracy. Now, if you actually think about how the former works, that is capitalism, the mechanism for creation of wealth and value in a society is entrepreneurship. And so there can be nothing more important in a society than those that get out there, think, use their noodle, and produce things that are good. Look, everything in these great societies that we have, these condos going up, these beautiful business buildings, that gorgeous house of yours, this infrastructure that we're using to communicate across time and geography, every bit of it was created by entrepreneurs. And so the mechanism of freedom is entrepreneurship, the ability to do what you want in a society. And there could be nothing more important for the future good of society, both from a wealth and a health standpoint.
So the fastest growing economy over the last couple of decades has been China.
Yes. And in that sense, you look at the benefits and the beauty that that has brought to that society. Okay, if we look back at China 50 years ago, it's not the same place. You look at Shanghai and there are no skyscrapers, for instance. And now there are 10 cities in China, perhaps 100, that look like that. Massive skyscrapers, one of the biggest construction projects in the history of the world.
So you're saying it's not communism, it's capitalism that has...
I'm saying growth? Both societies require two major pieces of software, capitalism and democracy. China lacks the latter. Okay. And so while they've done great in the capital sense and they have improved health and wealth, they're now again at risk of internal conflict because the standard response to too much liberty in a communist society, which is the way they would describe themselves, the CCP, is limiting to the power of entrepreneurship. You need both. And if both don't flourish, both are hindered.
Tell me a little bit about this speech. 150 people?
Yeah, we actually had 180, and we were surprised to have that many show up. And usually you lose about a third of your registrants. But I think that there's a palpable desire to improve societies today. People, not everybody goes out and tries to protest in the streets and scream their head off. Other people channel that energy, that fear, that disappointment in society into actually doing something about it. And so I'm standing there in front of this amazing group of people hosted by Microsoft at HQ with the CN Tower in the background, magnificent setting at CIBC Square, the new CIBC Square building. And you look at the faces on these kids and the future's bright. Okay, these are 20-somethings that have some of the grandest ideas I've ever heard of that make sort of the things I've done look a little provincial by comparison. The ambition is what we have to culture. That's what we have to encourage. And that event was specifically designed by Microsoft's Reactor, which is kind of their public-facing organization to bring people together in a community. it's designed to give them that platform and to give them that first taste of what it is to be an entrepreneur and how hard it can be. You know, for these young people to stand up in front of 100, it's one thing for me to stand up in front of you, and I have given speeches all over the bloody place, didn't matter. But for a 21-year-old to stand up there with their idea in front of great and powerful people, you know, forget me, but the rest of the crowd that was there, that's something. And you do that a few times and you start to get used to it. And that's how we create the future of our beautiful societies.
Ambition is what you said was the key. And so is it capitalism and the profit motive, or is it something else?
Well, so if we go back to Adam Smith, okay, there's a misinterpretation of Adam Smith, I think, you know, through the culture wars and stuff. He's sort of seen as invisible hand man, okay, and just let the market do what the market does. That's not what he said, okay? This is really important for people to understand. What he said was the best way to distribute resources around an economy is, in fact, the invisible hand. Okay, that is, let's say, fair economics. Let the market do what the market's going to do, and ambitious people will rise to the surface. But he also said, and this is the part that people forget, they have to turn the page to understand it. He said, but the market will always be a Pareto distribution, okay? Stack ranking the chips in sort of one person's hands in the end. And that's where you get these inequalities in society. Inequality is not a good thing. And Adam Smith said, anybody who ends up with a monopolistic position of any shape or description, whether it's market power or all the chips in the game, or, you know, like you win Monopoly with all the cash, this is not healthy. And it will forestall, it will forestall flourishing on the democratic and capital sides. So, you know, much like the sort of China model that we talked about, unless you provide this to a society, unless you encourage it, and unless you make sure that the market doesn't become a perfect Pareto distribution where one person ends up with all the chips, you're going to have a problem in your society, and that's why you see China not performing quite as well as, say, the rest of Western societies or Asian societies that have embraced both democracy and capitalism.
Explain a Pareto distribution, please.
So a Pareto this is an equation that if you run it, will eventually give all the chips to a single person. So in society, you can look at a Pareto distribution is just you take a distribution curve and you say, what does it look like?
Like a bell curve.
Well, and bell curve's a great example of it, okay? So, but the Pareto distribution is something over time. What happens to that bell curve over time? And the answer is, in a Pareto distribution, it's something like 10% of the population ends up with all the chips in every round that you play. By the end of it, there's a single person that has all the chips. And what that is the rich get richer, okay? If you want to simplify it, the concept of laissez-faire economics is the most powerful always wins. That's roughly what it equates to. So if everybody starts out with $5 and you run a game, you know, in economics, we call you run these games and you can sort of figure out what's going to happen in a simulation. One person gets all the $5 bills despite there being, say, 100.
So we don't like capitalism then. Communism should be the answer.
Well, so what we know is that humans are humans. Okay. And we used to think 100 years ago, Engels and Marx started to articulate that the free market was, in point of fact, terrible for us, as you've just, rhetorically pointed out. So now I'm going to rhetorically respond and say, but we also have 100 years of data that says otherwise. And the reason it's really important to know that, and I think a lot of people have forgotten, because communism is every young person's dream today. You and I grew up in a world where we had fought that as well and won. But now it's back. And people think it's the right thing to do. The body count for those that choose capitalism but communist government is in the hundreds of millions. Okay, it's human nature is the problem, and it's the reason Adam Smith said what he said. You need to let humans be humans because they'll always be humans. And we saw that in communist societies, where despite the fact that money was not able to be sort of sought, prestige and power and elitism and, the sort of mandarins running the show, that became the thing.
That became the goal, unlike profit.
By virtue of people's character.
Crazy. We got to take a break. Fascinating conversation. We're going to come back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. We're talking with Murray Simser about entrepreneurship and capitalism. And is it important? Has it actually built the Western society, if not, frankly, the world economy and technology and development and progress that we have today, even sometimes when it's coupled in communist countries? Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Murray Simser, who's really got a fascinating background. He's worked in politics. He's got a really good background in education. He went to Silicon Valley and made technology and some money, and then came back to Toronto. And now he's trying to use technology to improve democracy with an app that is called Citizen. Murray, this speech on entrepreneurship that you made to a whole bunch of young people. Did they listen? Were they interested? Do you think they bought into the appeal?
Well, in the same way that you see on social media, young people buying into the other types of appeals, I would actually argue that they not only bought into it, there was a glint in their eye. There was something there. These people in the room really wanted to improve society. Now, as you know, not every entrepreneur is going to succeed. But what's important to remember, and this was the message I delivered to them, and all of their eyes lit up, was even if you fail as an entrepreneur, you have added value to a society. And this is perhaps the most important message, that we always talk about pick yourself up when you fail, but we don't actually talk about the mechanics and the benefits of failure. It takes 10 startups to fail for one to succeed. Okay, this math has been understood forever. And because of that fact, even a failed entrepreneur has added value to society. So for instance, if you look back at .com, now we look back at .com and go, ooh, we are on this infrastructure that is wonderful. Look at you and I on opposite ends of this 10 million person city having a perfectly live conversation, high resolution, all the rest. That didn't exist when we started. Okay, and so that took, for the 10,000 companies that succeeded during .com, that built all of this digital infrastructure, there were probably 100,000 that failed. And when you think about that message is the most important thing. And I liken it to the man in the arena speech by Teddy Roosevelt. You know, it's not the critic who counts. Okay, it's not the person who tells the strong man how he could have done the work better. It's really about the man in the arena. So my message to them was, do it, and do it even if you fail, and you'll be proud of yourself, and you will have added value to society.
But Murray, today we've got, I don't know what it is, 5 companies on the S&P 500 that are like, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% of the S&P. I don't know what the exact statistic is, but it's, we're dominated by just a few technology companies in value, where, you could add up, hundreds of companies and you wouldn't get the value of Apple or Google.
Yes. And that's entirely correct. And there's a reason for that. If we think back, let's think back to the great explosions that were economic in nature, okay? The very first one was the Dutch East India Company. This was an expansion of untold proportions. And the tool that they invented was trade, okay? So, they set up all these trade things in India, moved things back, sold things. That was the market that was created by the Dutch. Then you go fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, the British Empire's contribution to the world, and you look at railroads and you look at oil and gas, okay, and electricity, the sort of 3 major pieces of infrastructure in the Industrial Revolution, and sewage and all the rest. The same concentrations of wealth that you just described happened then. And so if you look at the most valuable company in the history, it is not Apple, nor is it Microsoft, Facebook. I expect you're talking about the FANG group when you're speaking about the 6. But the thesis is these companies' valuations are less than a third of what the Dutch East India Company was. And again, the same sort of thing, if you look back at sort of the electricity company, the Edison sort of business, the robber barons, the oil and gas, Standard Oil, all these sorts of things. Their valuations relative to market, the total market cap on the stock exchange, was far and away higher than we have today. But the message is clear. Adam Smith says it absolutely correctly. You cannot have too much concentration or bad behavior happens. It's as simple as that. Okay. And what happens then is rent-seeking behavior within the context of those monopolies. So if you think of Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook and the gang, They're starred at Google. They've got so much control over the market that at the end of the day, they can basically dictate terms and they can reduce innovation spending, a whole bunch of things to maximize profits. But that's why capitalism is so important. Okay. And what it is that rent-seeking behavior creates an entire opportunity for new entrants to come in. And frankly, that's precisely what Citizen's going to do. Okay. And that is the reason that capitalism is so important. You need people to compete and to hold to account the monopolists.
Have you seen the movie about BlackBerry?
I haven't yet.
It's a great movie, and I think it really speaks to your thesis incredibly well. Where here BlackBerry was controlling the smartphone business and got destroyed with one announcement by Steve Jobs of the iPhone.
100%. And they weren't alone, by the way. Okay, Steve Ballmer. So I was at Microsoft when that was going on. Steve Ballmer did the same thing. So everybody dismissed Steve Jobs as, remember, Apple back then was just coming out of the sort of malaise era that it had after it had, in the 90s. Steve Jobs was brought back in to reinvigorate the company. People forget that he invented these iMacs that were colorful. Then he came out with the iPod. Then he came out with the phone. And then he came out with the tablet. And then he came out with, look, the rest is history. Everybody buys Mac products if you're a Mac guy. And, ever since that time, the percentage of the OS, which was about 3% when he came on board, that was OS X, which is how a Mac runs, versus 97% Windows, it's now 35% or 40% Mac and 60 or 65% Windows. Competition matters. And it matters so much that Jim Balzilli and Mike Lazaridis, they were literally described in sort of colloquial terms as drug dealers. Crackberry is what we called it. We loved our Blackberries, as you recall. We couldn't get enough of it. It was the first smartphone. We invented the concept here in Waterloo, okay? And the sort of thesis here is that's why competition matters, because individuals are not always capable of predicting the future, but groups are. And the more, as you know, as a finance guy, the more information that's available to a market, the better the distribution of resources is going to be. And so more entrants matter. And if the old entrants can't handle the heat, too bad. Move on. That's the nature of the beast, but it's also what protects our fundamental liberties. Liberties are taken away by elitism, and elitism and aristocracies are created by monopolies. That's it.
So given this Pareto distribution that everything will end up being in the hands of one person, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, do we need more anti-competition, anti-competitive legislation, regulation, trust breaking, etc.? Or given what you've described as innovation and effectively creative destruction and new entrants, we don't need any because someone's going to come in and destroy their innovation at some point in time.
Well, the short answer is, I think Adam Smith says it best. That depends on your point of view. If you're a Democrat in the United States, trust law is something you love very much, and it's something that you want to do is use the Justice Department to, for instance, go after those 6 companies that are currently dominating the market cap of all of the exchanges of repute in the United States. So the NASDAQ in New York. The sort of thesis, though, that the thesis you're asking me to discuss is very much a religious argument. Okay, and I think this is where rubber hits the road when it comes down to it. Is it better to let the market fight against monopolists, or is it better to have governments intervene and fight monopolists? So in Canada, a good example today is the grocery chains are on the receiving end of government pressure to change their margins. Stop being so monopolistic about it. I'm not sure that they're monopolistic, but at the end of the day, the government needs a hobby horse that they can sort of chase and get attention with. So I don't know. I think that the answer is it depends on the industry. It depends on just how monopolistic things are. And I'll just point out, is it really monopolistic to have 6 companies competing with each other? I mean, if you think about it, that's the terrific market economy. We have Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook and Apple and a variety of other major corporations in the world competing to improve and optimize the digital space. I mean, I don't know why we need to trust break that, but people do feel the need to. And if you look at the public data on this, people are really grumpy about the fact that these 6 companies seem to have all the stuff. But I'll just point out, these companies also produced this wonderful new future we live in that allows us to have these beautiful digital conversations, this beautiful digital space that we all now live in, probably more important even than our other space. We got to be careful about becoming too prescriptive about the market, but that doesn't mean government shouldn't intervene. They need to legislate, they need to manage. The government is here to protect us from monopolies. And they should be very leery about jumping too far into a market lest they destabilize it and wreck the way the distribution of efficiency is happening.
Well, you went back to the Dutch India company. I don't think you have to go that far back. Back in the 1940s, 50s, oil companies dominated the S&P, and then became industrial companies that dominated the S&P. And then in the 70s and 80s, it became financial institutions that dominated the S&P. And then it became technology companies that dominated the S&P. And so this creative destruction and which technology is more important, whether it's oil or manufacturing or bankers or smart technology guys like you, changes over time.
But I'll point out, let's take the long view, because I think these short views have a tendency to make us a little myopic when we look at things. If you look at that period of time you just discussed, do you know that our health tripled? We lived 3 times longer from the time the robber barons existed to now. Okay, the average age was 32 years. That's how long you lived back then, back in the train days of robber barons and this business. And now here we are. We live to 90, 100, 3 times as long, and we are dozens of times more wealthy than we were even 100 years ago. So if you take the long economic view, you end up with capitalism and democracy produces outsized health and wealth in a way that no other system has or could. Okay, the proof of that is China. Any country that moves towards democracy and capitalism even a little bit benefits in an outsized way, because this social software, as I call it, really is the mechanism by which health and wealth are created.
This is a fascinating conversation. Do you think they heard you, all these young entrepreneurs?
I think the young entrepreneurs did. The entrepreneurs have a really interesting quality. Have you ever heard the Steve Jobs Apple commercial from the 90s? Think different. Here's to the crazy ones. I think that the entrepreneurs heard me loud and clear, because, as they say in that commercial, entrepreneurs don't have any respect for the status quo, which means they're totally prepared to believe in what they're doing. You have to be a special person to want this life. Okay, the abuse that comes with the attacks. You go see an investor, you put your best foot forward, and the investor tells you you're an imbecile and they would never invest. I mean, this stuff it's not for everybody. Okay, it's sort of a bit like politics. You really have to have thick skin. Okay. I think those entrepreneurs will be fine. I think what I noticed was not the entrepreneurs that were desirous of achieving have, but the people who weren't entrepreneurs that were in the room, there's a good portion of them, their eyes lit up. And I think they felt they have agency when you tell them democracy and capitalism are the software that you've been gifted from our forebears. And once you understand just how powerful that gift is, it's pretty damn motivating. And I hope I motivated them.
Murray, you talk about some of the challenges and some of the negative. You posted about you haven't lived until you've been canceled, about how a group at Harvard tried to cancel you. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Murray Simser and ask him, how was he canceled? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
15 seconds. Starting now.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting with Murray Simser tonight, and we've just heard his the content of his speech about entrepreneurship and capitalism and democracy to 180 people at a Microsoft Young Entrepreneurs session. But I've got to ask you about how you survived a Harvard Clique's attempted cancellation and that you haven't lived until you've been canceled. Tell me what happened here, Murray.
So look, first off, not everybody's going to like what you do, okay? And not everybody's going to like you as a person. I think that's the lesson in this whole thing. I had an engagement with somebody where I was chatting with them, and they just did not like what I was going to put forward. In fact, some of the choice words that were used were, "I'm a fool for thinking I can do this. How dare you think you could pull something like this off? You can't actually measure the things that you're claiming you can measure." I mean, it was a pretty... I'll note that in my estimation, these people have a bit of a vested interest in me not succeeding because they're sort of the existing political class. But in the final analysis, your question is, what happened? And the answer is, when I was hosting an event, they actively pursued other people that were going to be speaking at the event to try to dissuade them from participating. And it's an astonishing thing to think about, that me and my sort of business associates are putting all we can do into improving society, and there's somebody that wants to kneecap you like that. It's an experience that has to be lived, but I'll tell you something, it's not a good experience when you're experiencing it. But with hindsight, I'll now quote Joe Rogan, post and ghost. That's the new thing, okay? Everybody's going to be canceled, so post and ghost. You post and you ignore all the trolls, you ignore all the people, and you press on, okay? Or to quote Churchill, keep buggering on, no matter what they do.
Well, or to quote Travis Kelce, who's my new favorite hero, you got to fight for the right to party.
Yeah.
You wrote, the antidote to societal dysmorphia is to celebrate the triumph of the West.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So let's put some objective stuff on the table, okay? Never in human history has life exceeded 30 years in length, average life expectancy, and never in human history has the average current dollars daily consumption ever exceeded $2, okay? Ever. Then the West came along. And from the time of the Dutch East India Company to now, there has been an unrelenting improvement in health and wealth in any society that has adopted two pieces of social software, democracy and capitalism, okay? Capitalism for the distribution of resources, democracy to control those resources in such a way that it helps everybody, okay? This is a fact that only applies in the West, period. Every great invention, science, electricity, everything you see outside here, all of it was designed by us. Now, is it hubris to say that? It's not. Yes. Nothing in the history of the world has done more good for humanity than the West, okay? Despite everything.
Let me interrupt just to read the list of the nifty little things that you produce, that you reiterate in your article that you produced. Emancipation of everyone, freedom from servitude, tripled lifespan, eliminated slavery, eliminated poverty, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, individual human rights, capitalism, democracy, science, social science, humanities, engineering, architecture, law, education, computers, the internet, mobile phones, clothing factories, retail therapy, and everything else that makes the world a great place.
I'm with you. I agree.
But then you said, for 40 years, we told people in the West, we are nothing but our faults.
That is correct.
Why?
Well, so what happens, what typically happens, if you think about sort of Marshall McLuhan and communications theory, you know, the medium truly is the message. And if you think about what that means in the modern sense with these devices, okay, and the social networks that are on them, the 6 companies you were talking about, you start to realize that about 95% of all human transactions are mediated by 6 algorithms. And this is really important. If you think back to the 90s, before the internet, there was an issue about concentration of mediatic power. We were worried about, you know, Conrad Black and a variety of other owners having too much power because they had they owned multiple newspapers. By comparison to that, The concentration of power in these 6 algorithms mediating our relationships, deciding when Brian Crombie and Murray Simser actually speak or see things about each other. That is the most powerful social engine that's ever existed. Now, what I mean by that statement in the post is it also means that people can now manipulate your mind in a significant behavioral way using those algorithms, whether it be politicians or businesses or foreign bad actors or people trying to hurt us. And as a consequence, the shaping of our minds has accelerated to a degree that Marshall McLuhan's entirely correct. The medium is the message, okay? We are literally the product of that medium now because we are the product in the medium. That has a massive effect on how our brain functions. And if you look at the cohort of people who are permanently on these devices, the younger you are, the more time you spend on it. You can see a direct correlation between time on a system and how people's opinions are affected, whether it be related to, this legislation, this foreign issue, or whatever. That's what I meant.
You wrote about the year ahead from a democracy standpoint in another post, and I think that I read that more than 50% of the world's population are going to vote in elections this year in
That's right.
2024.
4 billion people.
And you said that informed consent was the minimum, and we are very lacking in information. Tell me about that post, please.
So I think there's been we're as a society, we're moving away from what I call the first generation of democracies, that is the representative democracies, okay? And we're trending towards, if you look at sort of the protests that happen downstairs here at Bloor and Young every day, if you look at the protests at Queen's Park, Parliament Hill, Washington, all of the places around the world, we're starting to come to a point where representative democracy is an insufficient mechanism to satisfy the agency needs of a very educated population, okay? Let's remember that when we created modern democracies in the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, most people were illiterate. They had no ability to even understand what they were talking about. And so it was natural to choose a person of letters, a person of education to go off to Ottawa or Washington or wherever it was to represent you. 60% of our population in Canada has a degree, okay? They don't want representative democracy anymore. And that's why you're seeing this massive explosion in self-identifying groups that organize themselves together and cause social unrest. You need to channel that energy, okay? And if you don't channel that energy, much worse will happen.
So what's the solution?
Well, the solution is direct democracy. If you think about the debates about representative democracy, you can go back to the federal papers, you can go back to all the different histories of the creation of life. The fight was always, do we have a king or do we have direct democracy or something in between? Most people settled on representative democracy. The Swiss famously have a more direct democracy than we do. They have their canton system. Everybody can go into the market square and make decisions with little cards that look like a soccer game, okay? And that is the power of the Swiss democracy. In California, for instance, we have what are called ballot initiatives, or actually, frankly, in most states in the United States, the people, if they get a sufficient number of signatures, can make a proposal for legislation. And if it passes, it becomes law. And then, the system will then assent to it because it's been directly proposed. The end game for all of that is the people controlling all legislation. That is proposing, structuring, evaluating, and they have to be baked into the basic legislative infrastructure for that to happen without toppling the existing infrastructure, okay? What you want is to improve the infrastructure that exists, not change it. So in Canada, the United States, and most Western countries, we have 3 government estates. We have the executive power, the legislative power, and the judicial power. The 3 co-equal branches of government theory in the United States, same sort of thing in the Commonwealth, Westminster-style countries, and even the same in sort of civil law societies like France and a variety of others. You need now to distribute that power down. So those 3 estates are no longer just a bunch of buffoons responding to this social unrest that I talked about, but they're actually able to channel it. And that's where the fourth and fifth estates used to have a job, which fourth is media, fifth is social media. They used to have a job to represent the people. That was their job, was to interface between government and the people. But they're not doing that anymore. Okay. Media, number four, traditional media, the share of voice relative to social media, the fifth estate, okay, is insignificant. It doesn't even matter. It's a rounding error that does not affect the mentality of people. Zero. Okay. The fifth estate, social media, is the equivalent of the printing presses arriving back in the day. And the only thing you can do to quell that type of unrest is create better democracy. That's what we did the last time this happened. Okay, that's where the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, French Revolution came from. The solution was give people power so they could vote. But it's once every 4-year power. We need power every day on every issue before government. And that's what Citizen built.
If people want to check out Citizen, where do they go?
You can go, if you're in Canada, you can go to the App Store and download it. This is the beta testing versions that you'll play with. In a couple of months, we go to our fifth prototype, which is actually our first release candidate, which is a commercial candidate where we'll actually be live. And people will be able to actively manage the Canadian government.
Murray Simser, thanks so much for joining us and inspiring us about the benefits of capitalism, the importance of creative destruction and innovation, and also a little bit about trust laws, the incredible power of technology, the importance of democracy, and the opportunity that citizens got to become the sixth estate. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Honored to be here.
We're going to take a quick break, and I'm going to come back with some of my own comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Murray, really appreciate it. Thanks.